Next, the last talk in this little session before lunch is Professor Sam McDougle. So Sam did his PhD at Princeton before going on to, surprise, surprise, do a postdoc at Berkeley, working with, amongst others, Rich Ivory, and has now started a lab at Yale University called Action, Cognition, and Thinking. And Sam gave a great demonstration of at least two of those three last night at the Art Salon, where he played the mandolin for us while charming the crowd with some really exquisite playing, some Irish reels and some bluegrass. So let's welcome him. Very interested to hear his talk today. Sam, over to you.
Is that good? Can you hear me? Check. Oh, yep, good. Just to make the concentric circles of this session even smaller, actually Ann Collins was my primary advisor in postdoc, so just making the community even smaller here. So this is going to be a bit of a different set of themes here. Hopefully some of you can make some connections between this and previous talks. But my lab is interested in motor skill learning and motor memory. Primarily, we're interested in coming at that less from the angle of direct muscle control or control theory, and more actually from the perspective of cognitive psychology. And today I'll try to hopefully motivate what that sort of work can do. But I like to start any talk that tries to link cognition and motor behavior by perhaps my favorite example that I think gets at this interface between cognition and movement, and that's this concept of motor equivalence. For those of you who know about this, this example might be familiar, but I'm going to show you a set of cursive writing here. And you might notice two things about these sentences. One is that they seem to continually get a bit noisier as you go down. That's true. But one thing you might notice is that the general structure, the sort of implied spatiotemporal dynamics of this cursive writing are really well maintained. And actually, that top one is the author, Raybert, in the 70s, writing this sentence out with his dominant hand. And everything else is him either holding the pen with a power grip, like I'm holding this pointer right now, writing it with his non-dominant hand, holding a pencil in his teeth, and then finally holding a pencil in his toes. Yeah. Oh, my beard is getting away the mic. Okay, another reason to shave. Can you hear me better now? Okay, well, at least I have text on the slide that told you the obvious conclusion here. So I think this is a really wonderful example of a very beautiful capacity we have to represent motor plans in some kind of abstract format. It's not exactly what I'm going to talk about today, but hopefully I'll get at some of the implications of the separation between this abstract planning space and this more concrete muscle command space. And generally, I'm going to talk about that in the context of thinking about planning and muscle commands as a way of sort of getting at this, perhaps getting at a sort of cognitive motor interface. And the way we do that is, of course, to just simplify the problem to the point of being a completely boring task. I'm sure we're all familiar with this sequence of choices we make in our labs. The task we use is actually a very old task. If you've all heard of prism adaptation from Helmholtz, this is a kind of zhuzhed up, modernized version of prism adaptation we call visual motor adaptation. And the way we study this is we have people make movements, sometimes on these overpriced fancy robotic devices. People make movements to visual targets without seeing their hands, so we can sort of isolate a visual learning, a process of learning from visual errors only, just to control our task a little bit more. People make movements to these targets. That's easy enough. We all know how to do that. But then we can actually induce these perturbations. We create, in this case, a rotational relationship between people's muscle commands and the visual feedback they see on the screen. And over time, I'm showing a cartoon performance curve here. People learn these tasks very well. It's not the most complicated task. Often there's many targets. I'm simplifying it even further here in this example, but people can get to asymptote in a series of minutes. Now, for many years, for reasons that have not been totally clear to me as a psychologist, people have thought of this learning process as being purely implicit. And actually, for anyone who's ever worn prism goggles on themselves and done prism adaptation, that can make sense. It does feel like you don't have total control over how much you learn or the after effects you have after doing these tasks. So there's a reasonable aspect of this assumption. But then again, for anyone who's sat down and done one of these studies, you can certainly think about the environment, right? And so my PhD advisor, Jordan Taylor, and myself later on, used a really simple task to try to separate what is truly implicit about people's learning in this task from what is just for lack of a better term, it's a dangerous word, but what is explicit? And the way we did that is to just have people report to us what they're doing. In other words, have them report their plan. Okay, have them report that cognitive, the thinky bits, the cognitive part, and then we can also measure the implicit part. So people just tell us, using these number landmarks, where they're aiming their hand. So let's say after they see a big rotation, they say, okay, I'm going to aim over here. Okay, I solved the task in a single trial. Cognition for the win. But actually what you see here, which is really cool, is a kind of a visual motor illusion sort of emerges, where people start to get worse at the task. Okay? And they get worse because there's an implicit learning system that's essentially driving adaptation without any need to confer with the cognitive system. Okay, so people drift out. They actually end up changing their aiming behavior. That's the sort of illusion. People think the rotation's getting smaller. It's fixed. It's a fixed rotation. So people's behavior ends up looking like this. They might reach to 8, report consciously that they reached to 6. They tell, and you can actually ask them, did your hand go to 6? And they say, yes, it didn't. And then you can just use subtraction, and you can isolate this conscious explicit learning from this implicit learning. So it's a really nice tool to do the exact thing that I want to do, which is try to get at carve nature in terms of motor behavior at this cognitive motor interface. You can plot these data, and you get these really nice functions over time, where purple is people's actual learning. This is the thing assumed to be implicit for several decades. And when you actually do this very simple reporting task, you assume your subject has some kind of conscious control of behavior, you get a very different story. And just because this is a mathematics conference, I guess I had to put some sort of equations on the screen. You can fit these data with these really simple Markovian learning rules, and they do such a good job that it's kind of, it's hard to get much better than these simple Markovian adaptation rules, which kind of look a little bit like the type of things you'd see in classical conditioning and eye-blink conditioning, which actually relies on the same brain area as this implicit learning, which is the cerebellum. So engineers for many years, maybe this is why people always thought this was implicit, because everyone who worked on this were engineers. No offense, engineers, but not cognitive psychologists generally. But engineers have come up with a really nice story of how this adaptation, this implicit adaptation system, motor learning system works. And it the kind of center node of this engineering diagram that I've colored here in yellow is this concept of a forward model, which is an internal model that makes sensory predictions based on outgoing or efferent motor commands. Okay? So the concept is that little green arrow tells the forward model, okay, I just sent motor command X, make sensory prediction Y. But there's a little mystery here, because motor command is kind of a loaded phrase. It seems to really say that something about the actual descending peripheral command to the spinal cord is also being sent to this forward model. But as a cognitive psychologist, I think that might be dubious, because like I said, whoops, my little animation here, we have, come on animation, behave. We can actually take that motor command box and we can separate it into two things. We can separate it into what the subject wanted to do, which is plan a movement to a particular direction, and what the subject's muscles actually do, which is move the hand. And sometimes those things are not the same, as I've shown. So essentially we want to ask, where does this supposed efferent copy branch off into this forward model for motor learning? Okay, you could imagine it branching off again at this lower level, at the level of some sort of peripheral signal. And you can also imagine it branching off at a higher level, like a plan. I think it's that one. That's why I had that flash. So that's the prediction. The prediction is that this higher level signal is actually the thing that seeds the forward model's predictions. That's the input to the system that really matters. And as I was thinking about this, there's some work that supports this concept in some general sense from Daniel Wolpert's lab. That was a citation on the previous slide, Sheehan et al. 2016. Some very nice experimental work. But I was thinking, I think we can push this concept to the logical extreme. And the logical extreme is that you don't even need to move to generate motor learning. That sounds goofy. So the first thing we want to do is, okay, I want to isolate implicit motor learning because I'm making a hypothesis about implicit motor learning, and I don't want that pesky thinky bits getting in my data. And there's actually a really simple method for doing this. So instead of doing a standard rotation task where people actually control the direction of the cursor and get better over time and are incentivized to use conscious planning, we just make a fixed relationship on the bottom here between we just decouple the relationship. So now the people always plan to the target. We tell them to do that. We explicitly instruct them to do so. We've done many validation checks to make sure people do this. They do. They always will report that their hand went to the target every trial, because that's what you told them to do. And then there's a fixed error every trial. So they don't even control the cursor anymore. So there's no incentive to move in any other direction deliberately, because it doesn't affect the task. It's a very goofy task, but it does a very good job of isolating this implicit learning process. We call it the error clamp task. It was actually developed by Ryan Moorhead in Rich Ivory's lab. So now that we've isolated implicit learning, we've fixed explicit learning, we've fixed this explicit plan at the target, and anything we see, any deviation of the hand in response to these errors is going to be implicit learning. And the way we're going to ask if planning alone, this is work done by Olivia Kim, who was a visiting postdoc in my lab, and she's now a PI at Bates College. And the way we thought it would be good to isolate the planning signal is, on some trials, just do a traditional single trial motor learning experiment. People plan to the target, they get a go signal, and then they reach, and they get this fixed error, and then we look at their adaptation on the next trial, and that's our implicit motor learning signal. However, on some percentage of trials, we give people a stop signal, okay? And by giving them a stop signal, and we give it at a very short time interval such that they make lots of errors, we want them to make errors because we really want to know that they actually probably planned a movement. But on those stop trials, we can make sure that they didn't actually execute any muscle command. Okay, so we have trials where people moved and got an error, and then we have trials where they supposedly planned and didn't actually execute a muscle command, but then we just simulate an error. A couple hundred milliseconds later, we show a visual error just as if they had moved in the movement trials. We mix all these trials up. It's a really difficult task. And we measure this single trial learning measurement. And just to explain that a little bit more, how this works is we randomize the error signal. If on one trial you got a clockwise error, then on the next trial your hand should deviate counterclockwise a few degrees. It's a very subtle learning signal. Similarly, if you get a counterclockwise error, your hand should deviate the next trial in the opposite direction. So that's our learning metric. That's our DV here. So just to make sure that people actually learn in this task, these are what the data look like on the actual reaching trial. So these are trials where the target told them to go, they planned the movement to the target, they moved, they got an error in some direction, and then they adapted in the appropriate counter direction on the next trial. So these are just normal motor adaptation learning data. But this is what it looks like when we just take the trials where they did not actually move, okay? And we were really happy to see this because we think it's really strong support for that, what we consider that's kind of logically extreme prediction that you can get motor learning without any actual measurable movement. And that's what these trials represent to us. Now, this type of learning actually retains into further trials too. So we think it's real motor recalibration, not just some little bias signal. Now you might be wondering, well, we didn't see people actually move at all. We didn't measure any millimeters of movement in the robot, but we could imagine maybe the signal got down to the muscles. So the next thing we did was EMG. And what EMG can tell us is maybe there's subthreshold muscle activity on those planning-only trials, and you need that to get glued together with the error to drive motor learning. These are what the EMG signals look like on movement trials. This is exactly what we should expect. So again, just a sanity check that we put our electrodes in the right place on people's body. And this is what the EMG looks like on the planning-only trial. So there's actually no measurable muscle activity, even though we still see motor learning. So we really think there's this cognitive plan happening at some high level in the sensory motor hierarchy. That plan gets shuttled down to the motor learning system. It generates a prediction. We show a violation, a virtual made-up violation of that prediction, and that generates adaptation in the motor system without any actual motor command ever having reached the periphery. But we think this is a cool discovery, but we kind of want to push it further and generalize it to domains that have less explicit control and less sort of potential confounds. And so the one that seemed the most obvious to me was speech adaptation. So you can actually take that adaptation task I described to you in reaching, or that Helmholtz did back in the late 19th century, and you can apply the same principles to the speech system. Okay, so when we form vowels, based generally on tongue position, we can change the format of those vowels. First or second format are the most important. And you can see here is just a plot looking at the first and second format on a graph. And you can see how different vowels, even in words that have similar consonant structure, produce different tongue positions. Okay, so the brain has to do a really complicated motor control problem, solve a complicated motor control problem when it makes vowel sounds. And the nice thing you can do is you can perturb, just like you can perturb the visual feedback from a reaching movement, you can perturb the auditory feedback from a speech movement. Okay, and the way you do that is you have this system where people hear their own speech in real time, okay, and when they make a speech act, you cue them to make a speech act, say the word bed, and when they say the word bed, you can perturb their feedback in their headphones, and you can actually slightly modulate the frequency of that first formant of a vowel. So bed might sound slightly more like bid in their headphones. People are generally not really aware of these perturbations at all, and they're certainly not aware of any learning they do. They just are saying words that are standard. And this is just showing what that adaptation signal looks like on a single trial level. So after I've perturbed the word bed, the first formant, I've perturbed it down in pitch, you actually correct up in pitch slightly on the next trial, and vice versa for the opposite perturbation. And you can imagine the method we used. We just used the same method we did for reaching, this stop signal task. So in some trials, you cued them to say the word bed, they would say it, and you'd play that perturbed feedback, and on the next trial, you'd measure the pitch of their spoken words, and you'd see the adaptation effect. And then occasionally, we give them these stop trials where just after we cue the word as they prepare to say it, we tell them to cancel that movement, and then we actually play a perturbed recording from a previous trial. So they get the audio motor error, but they didn't actually generate a speech act. So it's just like the reaching task. And these data are fairly new, so we're still working on it a bit, but we see the same effect. So we still see adaptation for speech movements even when people only planned them and didn't execute them and heard the error. So what we think and also the amount of learning they do in those no planning trials is correlated with the amount of learning we measure in the movement trials, suggesting they're coming from the same system. 5 minutes, perfect. So this has pushed us to think, okay, if this planning signal coming from somewhere higher on the sensory motor hierarchy than an actual muscle command that reaches the periphery, if that is the signal that seeds this implicit learning system, it sort of opens the door for lots of rich contextual influences on what is putatively an implicit motor learning system. And this is something we've begun to explore more in the lab. If you think about this kind of planning and goal box here in blue, seeding the forward model, you can think, well, what are the different, what we're calling kind of cognitive determinants of what goes into that planning goal box? You can imagine contextual signals now matter. This has been, we think we've shown this pretty clearly, that even arbitrary sensory cues can actually push the adaptation system around as if it was like a Pavlovian conditioning situation. The value of different movements seems to have an effect on how much learning you get. Attention certainly matters, and things like even metacognitive belief states. And just as a final point, I think this is, after all, a neuroscience workshop, so I have to have some neuroscience. There's a growing understanding of sensory motor cortex activity coming from people like Mark Churchland and company, that there are sort of orthogonalized activity dimensions in the sensory motor cortices for goal-directed movement. And the way that Mark Churchland has put it in a really beautiful review that came out actually just a month or two ago is that it seems to be that there's two particularly important dimensions for goal-directed movement. And one of those is what he calls a null space preparatory dimension. And the reason it's called null space is because activity explained along this dimension doesn't actually affect muscles in any reliable way. In other words, it seems like the motor cortex and premotor cortex have set up a situation where they can compute all kinds of interesting planning variables without those computations leaking into actual muscle commands. Of course, orthogonal to that, there's an actual readout dimension, which is actual the production of muscle commands. So I think what we're getting at here might, and I'm speculating, might be related to this sort of orthogonalization, that you can have all these complicated preparatory variables that don't actually drive movement, but seed computations in the movement execution system. And so just to conclude, I think it's difficult to understand motor learning without considering also deliberative processes. I think we need to get rid of our super narrow definition of motor control and motor learning as this like purely implicit automatic thing. That's clearly part of it, but that's not the whole story. I also think planning processes in some sense might be able to be abstracted from actual movements and might actually seed the movement system. So there's a really interesting interaction here, even though there's not a direct mapping. And finally, I think my lab is interested in separating cognition and movement in terms of conceptual boxes that we like to say this thing is cognitive and this thing is motor. But ultimately, we think that's just a shorthand, and really, to understand naturalistic motor skills, we can't ignore this cognitive side. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. We've got time for a couple of questions. If anyone, oh, yeah, there we go.
Is it on? Okay. Thank you very much for the talk. I'm just a little bit, I have a problem because I think there is, you can still have implicit control with, you don't need explicit control, but you can still plan implicitly. Like you don't have to use your higher order cognition, you just can go with very implicit, I don't know how to describe it.
Yeah, I think I get your question. I totally agree. I think I'm speculating that the planning state that we're measuring here also might include or be affected by like explicit control. But I haven't tested that. I have definitely not directly shown that. Yeah.
A follow-up question. There is also a lot of literature on when you ask people to think about what they're doing in these kind of motor learning tasks and talk to themselves, they usually do poorly, more poorly than when they just, I was wondering if you seen this similar trend in when you do the movement angle.
Yeah, so you're talking about motor imagery.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, motor imagery, it's a complicated field. There's a lot of conflicting results. A lot of data, I think, points to motor imagery being extremely visual. So there's a question of how kind of motor is motor imagery. There are some people actually trying, I think people are trying to replicate our result right now with asking people to imagine movements and then showing them a virtual error and seeing if that works. I don't know the state of that, but I imagine there might be timing problems because when someone imagines a movement, you don't know when they do it, right? And you don't know the dynamics of it. Whereas in this task, at least the planning stage and the error stage are within a couple hundred milliseconds from each other by definition. So, yeah, I think that's an open question too. Both good questions.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks. Very wonderful talk. I was wondering if you keep speculating a little bit more in other contexts, like there are many actions in which maybe plan and action are more intertwined, like more, I don't know, I'm even thinking via point or choices. So you beautifully separated action and planning, but can you elaborate more if those need to be kind of, I don't know, alternated somehow?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, that's a great question. I think the first example, like the motor equivalence literature, I think is getting at maybe more what you're talking about, where the plan is actually something more interesting than like a vector in one direction, and is like some sort of spatiotemporal profile with maybe some interesting like character primitives, and that directly shapes the movement. So we're doing some work on that right now with fMRI, trying to see can we decode these kind of abstract templates. But yeah, I don't have a big speculation. I mean, I think those systems adapt, so I think all the same principles here would work for more complex naturalistic movements that have a much bigger burden of planning. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
conversationally? Maybe?
We can talk offline.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Into lunch. We're going to put up the totems now for the poster session, which was later in the day, but if you're early back from lunch, please feel free to put the posters up. Okay, thank you all. Enjoy lunch.